Perfect. Hi there. We're just going to wait for everybody to sign in. So we'll just wait about 10, 20 seconds. Cool. Okay. I think we'll start now. So thank you everybody that's attending tonight. Really appreciate giving up your time. And thank you, Colin and Ben, helping us put this on as well. I think it's going to be a really interesting hour. Tonight, just give you a little bit of an overview. So Ben can go through some of the structure in a second in terms of what we'll talk about, but just a bit of housekeeping. We've got a Q&A box at the bottom. So throughout the session, just ask any questions you want. You'll see it on the bottom. It's a Q&A box, and put your questions in there. If somebody else has asked a question that you like, instead of rewriting it, just click vote on that, and then the most voted questions will go to the top of the screen. And Ben can tell you a bit about some of the prizes and stuff we're going to give away. So yeah, it'd be good to get some questions in there. And for future ones as well, obviously it's great to see so many people signed up for this as well. If there are things in the future you guys want to hear more about, then chuck it all in the comments box as well. But I think let's get straight into it. I'll introduce you, so pass you over to Ben now, and you can go a bit more about the structure and what we're going to talk this evening.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. Yeah, thank you to everyone for signing on, and thanks to Charlie and Physique as well for setting it up, and Colin for giving up his time. Really appreciate it, Colin. And yeah, it's nice to see so many people on the webinar, so thank you for coming on. I know you probably saw it when we put the marketing out, but we're going to split the webinar basically into 3 parts. So the first 20 minutes or so, we're going to talk about heads of performance. We're going to have a little discussion around head of performance. And then the second block of 20 minutes, we're going to talk about working with external practitioners from both points of view, whether being in a club or you being the external practitioner. And then for the final 20 minutes, like Charlie said, we're going to go into some Q&A. So take the opportunity to post your questions in the Q&A. We're actually going to give away, we're going to pick some of the best questions. We're going to give away, we've got some ebook bundles, so some speed ebooks, and we'll give away some bundles of those ebooks as well for the best questions. So make sure you post your questions in the Q&A. But I'm sure the main reason why a lot of you are here is to hear from Colin. So we're going to swiftly shut up and get Colin speaking. And I'm sure everyone knows about Colin. So Colin was the former head of medical at Arsenal and is current director at the Lewin Sports Injury Clinic. Obviously extremely experienced, and we'll tap into his experience on this webinar tonight. So Colin, thank you again for coming on.
Thanks for having me. Good evening.
So we'll kick it off, Colin. So the title of the webinar is The Makeup of an Effective Sports Science and Medical Team. So just to start on that, the role of head of performance, this is one that I think has got more popular recently, but we're going to have a little discussion around who that should be. So the role of head of performance, I just said to Charlie before, no one does a degree in head of performance. No. So who should it be, and what are some of the sort of discussions that go on around appointing a head of performance?
I've always found it quite a funny title. I think the head of performance for us was always the manager, the coach. Because when the performance was poor, he got the grief, quite rightly. When the performance was good, he got the praise, again, quite rightly. So I always found it quite hard, the whole idea of performance director, head of performance, because it didn't quite fit, the title didn't quite fit the role for me. But having said all of that, it is becoming more popular, and I think it is becoming a recognised role at the bigger clubs, the bigger federations. So to answer your question, who should it be? Everyone's probably sitting there expecting me to say it's got to be a doctor or it's got to be a physio, it must be medical, must be medical. But actually, although I probably do lean towards that, I think the person's attributes are far, far more important. So if it ends up being a sports scientist or an S&C coach, the attributes of that person are far more, I think, important than their background or their speciality, if you want. I think experience is key. And, experience to me is just a number of mistakes you've made. I think that's what experience can be classified as, a number of mistakes you've made and what you've seen and done. So I think someone's experience is important. I think leadership qualities is the obvious thing to say. That's hardly a groundbreaking statement, is it? But someone who can get the best out of their team, whether that team's 4 people or 12, 15 people, I think someone who can get the best out of that group of people and inspire them to be the best they can be and everything else, I think is the most important part of that role. Whether you're a doctor, physio, sports scientist, S&C coach, I'm sure I've missed 1 or 2 there, but I think that's the most important thing. No ego, I think, is vital. I know I harp on about that a lot, but I think egos can really get in the way when you're in that role, because I think the whole part of that role is to make everyone else in your team look good and to recognise and praise when they're doing things well. And I think an ego can get in the way of that. And I'm not sure any leader really in that industry should have an ego. But, it happens, and sometimes they do very well. But in my opinion, it's something that can hinder your ability to do that role properly. A good decision maker is an obvious thing to say as well. I think I've seen it over the years where people aren't that great at decision making because you eventually have the accountability. And there's nothing worse than someone who's in a head of performance role, who isn't accountable for the key decisions that are made. And that can also upset the apple cart sometimes. I think you have to be accountable. The only one caveat I would add to all of this is I think medical roles probably just fit into that role easier, be it doctor or physio, is the clinical governance and the medical governance, which comes along with that accountability, which also brings in indemnity as well. So final decisions about return to train for injured players should be made by medical personnel for me. Now, you listen to everyone's thoughts, of course you do, and it's a shared decision on return to train, quite rightly. But accountability with return to train from injury, with the medical governance, I think needs to be doctor or physio. But I'm sure there's some other views that are different to mine. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. I think that the attribute or the skill set of the person is an interesting one, isn't it? Because obviously you mentioned some really important skills there. So would you say it's possibly more important for that person in that role? Obviously, they've got to have the understanding throughout the team, haven't they, of all the different roles and the skill sets of individual people. And that integration has to become really important as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And, they have to have the respect of the rest of that team as well. I think you have to have respect for the leader. And if you're not entirely convinced on what that leader is doing or where they're taking the team or decisions they're making, that can get in the way. So all the attributes we spoke about just then is going to help you get the respect of that team.
And then going forward with that role, because I think it's only going to stay around, isn't it? And
yep.
like we said, and I used the phrase before, that we don't do a degree in head of performance. So it's going to be interesting, sort of how that develops and goes forward, and who's in that role. So what's your thoughts on that in terms of, like, do you think it is going to lean a little bit more on the medical side, or do you think there's going to be other roles, and that's not just sports science, but other people getting landing in those positions?
Yeah, I don't know. It's not beyond the realms that a psychologist ends up in that role one day. There may be 1 or 2 out there now that I'm not aware of, but I think it doesn't matter. Their attributes are important. Now, I don't know the data, but you get the feeling that there is a growth in S&C and sports science getting into those roles, probably. Shout me down if I'm wrong. going forward to follow the more European model and perhaps even the American side of things as well, it wouldn't surprise me if a sports medicine doc, especially in the higher divisions, end up being in that role, because it ticks all the boxes for indemnity, clinical governance, insurance. I just think it's a natural gravitation towards a sports medicine doc being in that role. But again, are they the right sort of person? Can you get the right personality, the right character, the right experience? Not easy. There's probably a wealth of physios and sports scientists that do fit that bracket. But the sports medicine doc is growing. The numbers are growing, aren't they?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, I don't know what you see, but I think I've been seeing a change in the fact that people understand each other's roles and respect each other's roles a little bit more as well, which makes teams a little bit more easier to integrate. I don't know what you think on that.
Yeah, definitely. I think there has to be a tolerance, and also you have to tolerate when people get things wrong, and that's from when the top man gets it wrong down to when someone in your team gets it wrong. There has to be a tolerance. No one's ever going to get it right every time. But you said something else there. Sorry, it just sparked something. Go back a bit. What did you say before that?
No, I think you touched on it there. Is it Charles? You know?
I was just trying to think.
No, I was going to move it on to because we'll have people in sports science and medicine teams, or potentially looking to eventually end up in sports science and medicine teams. Now, you've obviously got a lot of experience working with different practitioners within a team. So, what are some important factors of a successful team, in your opinion?
Again, you've already said it. I think being respectful of each other's roles. I think that's what I was going to say, actually. I think there's this thing now where the a lot of physiotherapists are moving into an S&C qualification, something like the UK SCA, which is obviously a really good one. And I don't think it's at all stepping on the toes of the S&C coaches or the sports scientists at all. I think it's learning to speak their language, understanding their thought process is better. And I think if you can speak the language and understand what's going on in their heads and what they're trying to get from that particular player in that particular rehab, I think it helps a lot. I think it really helps things out when you have physios with a good S&C understanding, even better when it's official UK SCA type stuff. Mm-hmm. So there's that respect of each other's roles. I think obvious things like communication are vital. I think the communication from top down and from bottom up has to be really good, especially as the numbers are growing now in these teams. I mean, in the last 20 years, it's ballooned, hasn't it? I think there's an overlap in roles as well, especially when it comes down to the field rehab side of things. I think nowadays there is that overlap between the S&C coach, the field rehabbers, be they sports therapists, physiotherapists. I think there has to be a clear delineation of roles and delegation of roles, because everyone thinks that their particular specialities should be doing that field rehab, or the early part, the late part. When do you bring a coach into it as well? So I think it has to be clear delegation of roles, and the scope of practice has to be to a level put in a box. I know there's overlap, but to a level where you can put it in a box. I think that's really important. But with all that, there has to be the accountability that I spoke about. Yeah. If you're going to take that player onto the pitch for the last 2 weeks of his long rehab, and you're going to do the field rehab, you're accountable when things go wrong. So there has to be a team agreement on what's going on and why. I think on the medical side of things, I've always quite liked to name the rehab lead in each particular injury. Didn't have to be me. I had 3 very good physios working with me. And I think when someone has got a long-term injury, to match that injured player with the best physio for them, I think was always quite important. Obviously, you're going to get relationships that are good and some that aren't so good. So to match the player to the injured, player to the physio, I think is an important thing to do as well. And that person then becomes the rehab lead for that entire process. And with that comes accountability as well, I think. But it works. A level of ownership around that rehab is sometimes a good motivating factor.
I was just saying we're starting to get some questions through. So guys, if you do have anything, just make sure you put it in the Q&A box, because we will get to those after. And I know you'll have some burning questions from what Colin's already talked about. So make sure you post them. But Colin, I think that was a great point in terms of communication and sort of these relationships between coaches and players. And obviously there's going to be practitioners out there that are at clubs and they're like, well, we only have one practitioner, we can't match players to physios because we don't have enough, which is obviously different situations. Yeah. But I think that is really interesting, isn't it? And the other thing I wanted to expand on was that delegation, the delegation of roles and responsibilities. Because again, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think years ago it was a case of player gets injured, they go to a physio. Then when they're fit enough to go to the fitness coach, they'll go to the fitness coach, and then they're passed on to technical. And there has to be that overlap now, doesn't there, to understand?
Yeah, I think in the early days, take a long-term injury, for example. In the early days, it is going to be more physio-led, but there's lots of stuff that fitness coach can be doing, and the good fitness coaches, S&C coaches, are banging on the door, saying, "When can I have him? When can I have him? What can I do? What can I do?" And we'd always put restrictions on what they could do, but they were straight into working with the fitness coaches as early as possible. They've all got weaknesses. They've all got other stuff that needs maintaining while they're having their treatment on their specific injury. So, yeah, I mean, the meeting after meeting after meeting, I know there is, and we can all have death by meeting, but those early morning ones are important for planning the day and getting those things sorted out early. You don't want mixed messages. You don't want poor organisation. Early part of the day, who's doing what, and those roles get delegated then for that day, that week, that rehab pathway. I think it is important. I mean, communication is such an easy word to say, but it's done so badly in so many places. And as the head of that medical team, if anyone in that team didn't get to know something that was important, it was down to me, and they'd come crying, quite rightly. However, if I didn't find out about something that had happened in a rehab that day, and it got dropped on me and I didn't know about it, I'd look stupid. So the communication had to be up and down, down and up. Not easy.
I suppose that's also where you've got to have that lead of some sort, isn't it? Because that's then where the final question goes from above.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, that lead has to be one single person, one voice, no mixed messages. Now, don't get me wrong, I think it can work where you have a very senior S&C and a very senior medical team leader working together. I think it can work if there's no egos and the communication is done well. But as long as no one's fighting for that top role and fighting to be the knowledge, I think a good understanding, I think it can be a dual role. I think it can work.
And I suppose with that as well, like you mentioned about these numbers growing, there's always going to be the fact that there's some people that just don't get on. They clash, personalities clash, isn't there? So I suppose there's that as well with these numbers growing, the roles growing. Even if we get the delegation right, communication right, there's still going to be certain flare-ups potentially between people just because of sheer numbers.
Yeah, but I think that's every workplace. I think as long as it's done behind closed doors, and these arguments are healthy. You want people questioned. You don't want someone there just nodding their head all the time. So you want to have these difficult conversations at times, do them in the meetings, get them done. But you don't want this world where everyone's sitting there nodding their head and not challenging you. But there's a difference between being challenged and arguing, I suppose. But it's healthy. It'd be a terrible workplace without the arguments and without the heated discussions, because it shows it means that much to people.
Just on that point, Colin. So the when you mentioned sort of having the, I suppose, difficult decisions and the confrontations, if you like, how important do you think it is for like the head of the department, S&C, sports science or physios, to kind of welcome it? And is it a difficult balance between welcoming people to challenge and stuff, but then also steering them in the right direction? Because it must be a tough skill to say, happy to take on the challenges and ways we can do it and work differently, but also you've got to convince them to, you all will be going the same way as well. So So how does a head of their department work on that?
You have to welcome everyone's view, that's for sure. You can't have people sitting in your team who don't feel they've got any impact at all or any influence, or they're banging their head against a brick wall, because they're going to stop bringing their ideas up. They're going to stop contributing. And you can't have that. You have to have everyone's point of view. I was quite lucky at Arsenal in that I always had very experienced physios working with me. I was given a budget to be able to get really experienced people: Ben Ashworth, Andy Rolls, Jimmy Haycock, Declan Lynch, Simon Harland. You know, there was quite a bit of a turnover, but it worked very well. And when they spoke up, they were coming from a point of view of experience and quality, and it all led teams themselves. So they appreciated my role in it. So in many ways, probably knew how to bring the question up so that it was done the right way, because they'd been in my shoes in good places before that. So maybe I was lucky, but you have to welcome it. You have to encourage it and tolerate it at times, because no one's feeling great 365 days a year. There were questions coming up at times and you thought, oh no, not again, here he goes. But you can't say that. You have to listen to it, because there's every chance they're going to be right a lot of the time, and you're going to be wrong.
Just on that, like creating this team, Colin, because there'll be people that are potentially going in for jobs. What are some key attributes, or I suppose standouts for you in terms of personality, or what do you look for in people that you're hiring, regardless of the role?
Yeah, it's hard, isn't it, when it's just a CV? You try and get the best you can out of interviews. But, and I sound like I'm banging a drum, but lack of ego, brilliant, essential. You can't have egos in a team.
Well, how would you see that in an interview, Colin? What would you look for in that?
Yeah, hard. I don't know is the answer. You'd have to do some unofficial and some official referencing perhaps, and just hope you get a feel in the time you've got with them. I mean, you can't ask someone, do you have an ego? The answer is no. But yeah, experience is really, really important. I know not every club has the ability to bring in experienced people. Sometimes your budgets dictate that you're going to have to bring someone in who hasn't quite got the experience, but a motivation and a drive and a history of going the extra mile, of working those silly hours that everyone does work, I think is also quite important. And, you know, if on your CV you've got lots of examples of working in a team environment, they're going to recognise what that means. If they've only been working on their own, they're not going to understand that team environment necessarily. They might, of course, but necessarily not always. So yeah, not easy. The recruitment thing is difficult, but again, it was made easy for me because we had such good quality applicants every time. But I know that's not always the case.
Yeah, definitely. Charlie, have you got anything else on that section, or should we move on?
No, I think let's move on, because there's a few questions flying in. So I think to get it all in, let's go to the next section.
See, I knew he'd bring the crowds in.
Yeah.
So we'll go on to the next bit. So I'm sure you saw on the marketing, but we're going to talk about external practitioners. So we'll talk from both sides. We'll talk from the coach's point of view that are at clubs, and how you deal with external practitioners, or your players working with external practitioners, but also the other side. So I'm guessing we've got some guys that work externally on the webinar. So we'll talk from both sides. But Colin, to start with, like, this is something that's definitely got more popular in the last few years, isn't it? So do you want to touch on any sort of experiences you had with it just initially?
Yeah, you're right. It's definitely growing. I was going to say getting worse, but no, you're right, growing. It's growing. It's difficult. It's happening at all levels. I think we're kidding ourselves if we think it's just the Premier League teams that have got this problem. Of course, it's attached to money and salaries. I think that's fairly obvious, but it's definitely happening up and down the league, and probably up and down the age groups, which is even more surprising nowadays. Yeah, we had a good few problems at Arsenal over the years. You like to think you knew about them all. I'm sure we didn't. But you had two choices as far as I could see. you could fight it and tell the player they weren't going to see that person, they shouldn't be seeing that person, be it a fitness coach, physiotherapist, massage therapist at times. No, you're not seeing them. Or you could get your arm around them, communicate with them, try and influence them and change the way they were working a little bit. Because I think if they knew what you were doing that day and the day after, and when, you know, what was coming up, they wouldn't be that stupid, I don't think, to interfere with what you're doing. So we always tried, whenever we got a sniff of a player having an external therapist, we always tried to get their details, make contact with them. You know, it wasn't easy. It's not something you wanted to do. It was an extra job on your hands to go and communicate with this person. But it was better than fighting it, I think, and probably better than ignoring it. So what I would say, I think it's important to make your manager and coaches aware that you know about it. I don't think it's right if your manager or one of the coaches in the team hear that your star striker's got someone in the background who he sees. That could undermine you. So I think it's important to get to the manager and coaches and make them aware that you're aware of it and you're managing it and doing your best to influence it. Because again, you don't want to fight. There's no point in a fight. But it isn't easy. And if you're juggling 2 or 3 of these at a time, it can be a bind. But there's every chance 2 years after this big chat that either the player has moved on, or a lot of the time the external therapist practitioner moves on, because, you know, players can be fickle. What was a brilliant practitioner 1 month can be a disaster 2 months later, and they get moved on. So yeah, it's complex. It really is complex.
With that, you obviously referred to it as a problem. So what are some of the biggest issues you see with it?
It is a problem. You know, in many ways, you're quite pleased that players want to go and do extra in the evenings. They're trying to work as hard as they can, but that isn't always the case. Sometimes they want their treatment session at a time that suits them. And, you know, realistically, a player flying over a massage therapist from Europe to work with them for a couple of hours on a Wednesday night, who then gets to train to Manchester to work with a player in Manchester, who then flies back from Manchester to Europe again, with probably a fair bit of money in his pocket from doing a couple of 2-hour massages, it can't be right. So it's difficult when you're talking about physios versus a massage therapist versus, you know, fitness coaches. You see YouTube videos, don't you, and Instagram posts of external therapists working with top footballers. And, you know, you can see how that suits that external therapist to get that exposure. It's not easy, but what are you going to do? Not fight it is the answer. But now it's difficult for us because now we're on the other side of it a little bit in the clinic. That we get players coming to us from clubs wanting second opinions and moaning about the treatment they're receiving and moaning about their clubs. Now, because we've seen the other side of it, we know full well that physio at that club probably isn't as bad as they're saying, and the treatment they're getting probably isn't that bad either. But they're disgruntled about something and come to us. The first thing we do in the first appointment is tell them that we want the physio number, because we are going to speak to them and tell them what's going on, because it can't be under the radar. So once you've spoken to the doc or the physio at that club, you explain what's happened. I think most of the time they welcome the fact you're calling them. And I think we try and work with them as quickly as possible and move that player back to that club as quickly as possible, because I know what it feels like, and it's an unnecessary aggravation.
And I suppose the discussion on that is where duty of care lies, isn't it? Like from both sides as well, with the player or the club.
The problem you have with external practitioners as well is they probably don't recognise the lack of indemnity they've got. Now, I'm generalising a bit, so some will have, but still there are chartered physios out there that don't know that we're not insured to treat footballers from the top 2 divisions in this country. So there's physios treating players from Premier League and Championship, and they're not insured. Now, if you're at a club, that club will have an insurance in place to cover you. But outside of the club, you're not insured unless you have your own policy, which I'm sure many don't, but some will have. And so, yeah, there's that as well. It's a very difficult one to work with, really. It's not easy.
I think it's good to talk to you about it because obviously you've been on both sides of it. So I think it'd be good now to just dive into and get into practitioners that are at clubs. And like you say, I'm sure there are some on this webinar that know of players that go out to external therapists, physios, fitness coaches, whoever. And I'm sure there's some that have players that go out that they have no idea that they're actually going doing that as well. So and I'm not expecting just an answer, this is what you got to do to combat that. But what are some bits of advice you give coaches in that scenario, Colin?
I think the difficult thing to accept is that external therapist practitioner has zero accountability. I mean zero accountability. They're just doing their bit with that player, sending them back to the club. If that player breaks down on the Saturday, that external practitioner isn't going to get the blame, is he? Publicly or within that club. So it's always going to come down to the head physio, the doc, and the S&C coaches at that club that are going to get blamed. So the lack of accountability of the external therapist is wonderful. But on the club side of things, there is that phrase that you can't be an expert in your own house. So this is always going to happen. But yeah, how to deal with it, talk and talk again. You really got to just speak to the player, go to them and convince them not to do it. I'm not sure that's the right way, but I think educating them on what you're trying to do, what the potential downsides will be, as well as some upsides, but the potential downsides of them working with that external practitioner. And like I say, getting the phone number of that practitioner, ringing them, speaking to them, and trying to open some sort of dialogue, because that's the only way it's ever going to work as best as it can for the player and for the club.
And to go on the other side of that, and from the external practitioner's point of view, what advice would you give those guys? Because how can we make it effective? Because sometimes players are reaching out for more than the reason that they just want to do extra. They might already have that relationship or something with that practitioner from a previous club or come across them before. So how can it work? How can we make it work better?
I would guess, the external practitioner needs to accept that the club are probably talking about them in some quite nasty terms, wondering why they're even necessary. So it probably suits some of them to maintain the secrecy and to maintain this cult status that, they're really, really important to that player, despite the fact they're probably only affecting about 1% of his week. They probably quite like the idea that they are seen as very important to that footballer. But you would hope that the external practitioners, the advice I would give them would be to get in touch with the club somehow. Because I know if I was a head physio at a club and someone called me and said, I'm working with your right back, I would welcome the idea they'd called me, and I would do my best to facilitate that to happen as best as it could. That's the only way it can work, I think. Yeah. I don't think many external practitioners are going to want that. I think they want to maintain some secrecy. They want to maintain some cult status at times. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think I would welcome all of them to ring the clubs. Yeah. But it's what we do here. Unless the player specifically says you do not ring them, and that's only happened once. All the other times we give the physio a call, and it's never really been a problem because we understand what their feelings are going to be on it.
Just on that point, from a player's perspective, I hear a lot of players talk about, I've paid extra to have physio and extra fitness sessions and stuff. And if you guys are looking at the extra 1%, and from a player who feel great, even if you guys medically and there's no evidence to back it up, but the player's really keen and thinks it's helping them and it's a big contribution to their performance, to what extent does that factor into your views and opinions about working with external practitioners if the players feeling like they're getting that extra 1-2%?
Well, if it's not detrimental and obviously I'm talking from a physio now, so there's not a great deal that can go wrong of a player being massaged on a bed if they're with a massage therapist. But if they're increasing their load with some extra field work, with some extra plyometric stuff, some strength work, I think you'd have to get the S&C coach on board and say, what do you think about this? And he needs to make a risk analysis of the benefit versus the detriment of what that player's doing. But, we always do our best to try and help the players and to make them happy, don't we? Everyone does that. And as long as there's not a massive detriment to doing it, then I think you'd have to get the S&C coach's view on what he thought. But again, there still has to be a dialogue. You can't have the risk that a player's done a load of lower body strength work on a Tuesday afternoon, for example, and then goes home and repeats that session on a Tuesday night with their man. I mean, that's not going to work. That's going to increase their injury risk, I would guess.
Yeah, because that's a lot of the time the reason that players will say that they're reaching out is because they don't feel like they're getting whatever it is, like the extra speed work or the extra strength work or whatever. But there's a plan in place, isn't there, at the club for a reason? Yeah. Like you say, if we're adding load at times where potentially the load's dropping at the club for whatever reason, that's planned into the programme. And then when injuries occur, that's when the finger will be pointed, isn't it?
And you know where it's going to get pointed as well. It won't be at the external practitioner. Mm. So, yeah, there has to be that dialogue to get some sort of plan, be it the one we call a 6-week plan. But you can't have a load of speed work going on one evening with your external practitioner and you come in next morning and the first team are doing the same thing. So from that side of it, yeah, it can only work if there's good communication. It does save a fight because, some clubs, especially in Europe, it's rife. Players are turning up with their own masseur and fitness coach and physio to the training ground at times. We were lucky we never allowed them in, but it happens. Not easy.
More clubs are doing that as well, aren't they? They're actually letting them into training grounds and facilities. So
I believe so. I know definitely in Europe, I wouldn't be able to comment on England, but yeah, in Europe I know of it.
Yeah, because if that's the case, obviously that brings essentially you're working within that facility, and do they then become an expansion of the team that we've spoke about before? Like that's the hard thing, isn't it, going forward?
Yeah, exactly. You don't want that. You don't particularly want to start welcoming in the player's own man all the time. It's not going to work, is it? It's difficult. Mm. And also, the external practitioners as well. You try and speak to an external practitioner, physio especially, and say, can you give me your notes on what you've done with him in the last 3 weeks? No chance. You're not going to get a set of notes from that practitioner to stick in his file. So it needs to be done. There has to be some level of accountability and indemnity again, but it's difficult.
And just to highlight, I've spoken to plenty of external practitioners that I know do amazing jobs, and they're constantly sending reports and they have great communication with clubs. So it can be done well, can't it? But I think a lot of what we see and that gets popularized is possibly the work that isn't as optimal and possibly a little bit more leaning towards catching the eye on social media. And there's the other side of it as well, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, how many fitness coaches do you think, when a player comes to see them on a Tuesday night, rings them an hour beforehand and says, you know what, I'm not sure you should do it tonight. I've had a look at your plan. I don't think you should come and see me tonight.
Yeah, great point.
Probably not many.
Yeah. We've got, I know we're not jumping to the questions just yet, but I've just seen one of them on here that relates to this, Colin. So this is from Tony Duggan. I'm guessing it's not the England centre forward, but we never know. And Tony says, what is Colin's opinion on foreign players going home or on holiday for their 4 to 6 week holiday in June and doing some work with an S&C or physio? Is it the same as an external practitioner working with them in season?
Well, that's a good question, isn't it? I think most medical teams and S&C teams, when it gets to the end of May, probably don't want players coming in with them right the way through June. So they'd probably welcome the idea that a player was going to spend his 4 weeks off perhaps with 2 or 3 of those working with someone in their own country. Yeah, I think that's, gets a bit hypocritical there, doesn't it? But I think there you'd probably be okay with it. But again, the same thing, dialogue, find out what they're doing, why they're doing it. Most players now will go away on their holiday in June with a bit of a plan from the club. Start running then, start this strength work on that date. But if there's someone there supervising that and someone you can influence a little bit to do what you want them to do, probably a good thing. I know we did it a few times. If we thought that a player who wasn't particularly great on sticking to our plan was going to have someone in his ear for that last 2 weeks of his holiday, that's good.
Yeah. Now, I think unless there's anything else you had to touch on that, Colin,
you were going to talk about duty of care. You touched on it briefly, but I didn't answer it very well. I think you were talking about the duty of care. Is it to the club or the player? And, something that's been asked for years. And I think about 10 years ago, do you remember the Bloodgate rugby thing?
Yeah.
The physio Steph Brennan was involved and the doctor was involved in that fun and games in the rugby. And he did a presentation for us after that because he obviously learned a lot about what he went through. And we asked him that same question. And I always remember he said that the duty of care for him was not to the player or to the club, it was to the profession. So his duty of care was to physiotherapy. And okay, that backtracks around to the idea that you're looking after the player. But I quite like the idea that your duty of care was if you can justify yourself to your profession, then I think you're all good. But I think it takes away this idea that is it club versus player? It's probably neither. Or both.
Yeah, great point. I'll just remind you guys, because I can see some of the questions coming in. We've got some really good questions, so we'll try and get through as many of these as we can. I think we'll dive into them now in a sec, Charlie. But some of the best questions, we're going to give away some prizes. So we're going to give away some of our ebooks. But Physique are also going to offer a voucher for any shout outs on, we're going to pick some winners for some shout outs on social media. So give us a shout out on some of the biggest takeaways from tonight, from what Colin's been talking about, and you'll have a chance of winning a voucher as well. So should we dive into some of the questions, Charlie?
Yeah. Like I said, there's quite a few. So we'll sort of pick the best ones we can find. So we'll start off. So Philip, he's mentioned one saying, you have been involved in football for many years. What is the best and worst change in the sports and medicine profession?
Oh, that's a big one.
We press pause while I think about it.
Yeah. He's quite polite and said many years as well. He didn't say how many years, but
yeah, I think the first thing that popped into my head was the best thing that's happened is the growth in numbers. The worst thing that's happened is the growth in numbers. It's a difficult one. That's a difficult one.
If you want to circle back, we can put your answer on social media or something later or tomorrow.
We'll get there. I think sports medicine. I think I wrote an article on it a couple of years ago with Gary. We compared 1987, when Gary was a physio at Arsenal, to 2017. So the same club, 30 years apart. And the biggest differences were probably the athletic ability of the players and the ground covered and the athletic performance for sure in the matches. Not that we could prove it from 1987 because there was no real data from then, but going back only 10 years, the data was very, very different. I think the athletic performance is a huge change. The scanning now, imaging, going back all the way back to mid-90s, you had MRI, you had X-ray, but I think nowadays the growth of ultrasound scanning and some of the other scanning technology now is unbelievable. And I know you should always treat the man, not the scan, but they are very, very helpful at times. The worst thing, that is a tricky one. Yeah, it's not the worst thing because it sounds like I'm putting it down, but as the numbers grow in physiotherapy, massage therapy, sports science and everything else, I think it's becoming harder and harder to manage people in that huge arena and to deal with everyone's points of view effectively. The wisdom of the crowd is probably a good thing, but when there's so many different points of view, it can be hard because you're not always going to agree, all of you. If you go back 20 years, the medical team there was a part-time doctor, me and Gary, so it was just our two views. Didn't always get it right, but two views was, very different to dealing with 8 and 10 views. So no, it's not the worst thing, but it's made things harder.
Cool. So Carl's asked, which kind of alludes to your question of growth in numbers here. So do you think teams are leaning more towards sports therapists rather than physios? And I suppose there's quite a few people on here that are either learning about sports rehab or sports therapy or physiotherapy. So it'd be interesting to see what your views are on that, and probably where it'll be in sort of 5-10 years time in terms of a makeup of a performance team.
Yeah. I think naturally I'm always going to be defensive of the chartered physios. So I accept I'm really biased because I believe there's a more rounded training, even though it isn't as specific in the sports therapy as sports therapists clearly are. I don't know. I think chartered physiotherapy is probably under a little bit of threat in the sports arena. I don't feel personally it's particularly well publicised or backed by our governing bodies. I think they're pretty poor in recognising physios that work in sport, whereas the sports therapists seem to be a bit better equipped on that side of things. They are becoming more and more prevalent, and it's a terrible thing to say, but as you go lower down the leagues and they're advertising roles for therapists at clubs on fairly low salaries, it seems to be sports therapists that are taking those roles and taking a chance on those roles, whereas the chartered physiotherapy does have the route of NHS and elsewhere. Sports therapy probably doesn't, and so he's being forced to take those roles. So I don't know the answer to this if I'm right or wrong, but I would guess there's more sports therapists employed in League Two than there are the Premier League. So how will it grow? I don't know. I'm biased. I want the chartered physios to carry on doing what they're doing, but I don't know if that's going to be the case.
That's a good point. Ben, have you got any? Have you had looked through any of the questions that have popped at you? There's quite a few.
Yeah, I've got to say there's loads and loads of really good ones as well. But I was just going to try and pick a couple of ones that you could potentially do give quick answers for, Colin. So on this one, Abby said, "Are you aware of insurance not covering physiotherapists within other sports?"
No. There was talk of rugby coming under that, but that didn't happen. I actually think it's a salary-based decision, because the idea being that if I make a mistake with a player earning 10 million a year and I get sued for his loss of earnings, then that's a huge payout for a chartered physiotherapist to have. And I think the insurers or the underwriters took the view that they wouldn't insure chartered physios to treat top 2 division players. Women's football as well. It wasn't just the men's football. So I think it's salary based. So I can't think of the other sports that would really have that same issue. I know motor racing drivers and basketball in America, NFL, are all earning loads of money, but they're not in the UK with the same underwriters. So no is the answer. It might happen. It probably will happen. But currently, I believe it's only football and top 2 divisions.
Awesome. And then another one from Jody says, "Is there a limit to how many members you can have as part of a medical team?"
Officially, legally, no. No. I think some of the bigger clubs have got a couple of full-time doctors, 5 and 6 full-time physios. Some of the bigger teams have that. And if they choose to employ 4 more, why can't they? I don't think there's a limit. I think there's a practical limit and a common sense limit, but no, there's no enforced limit.
And then just tying in with that, Samuel said, "When matching the physio to the injured player, are you considering the physio's specific scope of practice / experience?"
Not scope of practice, because I would hope any chartered physio could treat any injury. it was more to do with the fact of what body part was injured, personality types, relationship between that physio and player. For example, at Arsenal in the last few years, we had Ben Ashworth, who had a particular skill and interest in shoulders. Andy Rolls was very good with the ankles and the syndesmosis at the time, and he was doing a bit of stuff with tendons. Jimmy Haycock was doing a lot of stuff around knees and cartilage stuff. So they all had their niche interest and niche skill. So naturally, if I got an injury that happened to fall into one of those brackets, it was a fairly obvious choice to who they went with, as long as they didn't particularly dislike that physio. So
yeah, which is what we touched on before, isn't it?
Yeah, and the workload of those physios. If I had been with 3 players and Rolsey and Jimmy had no one, then obviously that player would go with Rolsey or Jimmy. You have to think about workloads and sharing that out as well.
And then I like this one, Colin. So this is from Anonymous. Who inspires you? Or who has inspired you? Obviously, apart from Gary.
Obviously, apart from Gary. Thanks for that. You know what? I've been really lucky to have worked with so many good doctors, physios, S&C coaches, and I think I think you can still line manage people that inspire you. I don't think it has to be anyone above you. I think that the work ethic of some of the people I've had with me, and I've named them already, the Dr. Gary O'Driscoll at Arsenal as well. He's really good at what he does. Great experience, has worked in a couple of sports. I learned a lot from him. I think he would inspire me, and I think some of the coaches as well. I mean, Arsene Wenger's an obvious thing to say, isn't it? To have worked at one club for that long, I think he's inspired me in a few things. But in the medical world as well, when I look at physios like Dave Galley, Dave Fever, Grant Downey, Dave Rennie, people like that have worked at the top end for that long, and I know what they're going through on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis, some of the challenges they've had, to be able to work for that amount of time in the sport they're in. I think people like that inspire me as well.
Charlie, have you got any there?
Or? Yeah. Got one from Jeff. How has Colin adapted to applying his experience and knowledge from a professional sports club at Arsenal to the Lewin Clinic together with Gary, and what are the different challenges? What are the different challenges to being an effective team?
Yeah, really different. I've often only got half an hour, or sometimes an hour, with a patient, whereas at football clubs, you get hours and hours in a day to work with them. So I've got a lot better at trying to effect change in a smaller amount of time, the same as every private physio does every day. It wasn't my skill set initially, and I found it quite difficult. But to have the big gym that we have, the rehab gym, is obviously really important. It's not just a clinical room, 1 in, 1 out. I'd find that quite tough just on a bed. Having the gym there has helped us to bring what we're used to really to the everyday people that come in. I miss working as part of a team. I think you often learn a lot, obviously, and you can bounce things off each other when you're working as part of a team, where you've got an S&C coach in the next room and a doctor in the next room. And, I underestimated how much you learn from people like that on a day-to-day basis. Okay, I've got Gary in the room over there, so let's not pretend it's all bad. But it's, I found it difficult, but it's been a steep learning curve. What I have found is people that come here and pay you to treat them are still more grateful than some footballers were. So that's been interesting, that you are, really affecting people to the point that they are really grateful most of the time.
I've got one here from Faraz. So he says he's gone for 2 questions, but we'll go for the first one because I'm interested to see what Colin says. So, hi guys, great chat so far. Just a couple of points from my side. So, Colin, what's your thoughts on over-treating, over-prescribing, over-training, over-imaging, And has sports medicine lost its way a little from the traditional methods?
Go again. So let me write these down. Overtraining.
Over treating.
Yes, it happens, but I don't think it's the end of the world.
Over prescribing.
I'm not a doctor, so I shouldn't be commenting too much on that. But in the sports medicine world, I think you've got to use every means possible to get the player out onto the pitch for the Saturday. So, no, I think you should be using every means possible. And if that means the doctor sometimes gets a bit aggressive with prescribing, I'm all fine with that. But again, not my role, but it wouldn't offend me too much.
And then overtraining.
Again, I'm not a coach, but but yes, I think it goes on. But I think overtraining is just as big a problem as undertraining. I think. Go on.
No, I was just going to say, and then I think I'm saying this completely wrong, but over imaging, is that imaging, Charlie?
Yeah, scanning too much.
Yeah.
Yes, but I think sometimes there is a pressure from player, coach, agent, sometimes family member, sometimes that everyone believes that you got injured yesterday. When's your scan? And that's a bit of a shame, but that's the way it's become. So, yeah, in many ways, that might be one of the things that's got worse. Going back to that previous question, is this whole idea that we are reliant on scan results now and treat them as gospel. I think players expect them now within a couple of days of even the most minor injury, which is not great, but good physios and good docs will know how to handle those reports and how to deal with that in the best way possible.
There's a few questions coming in through, I presume, quite a few students and people starting out in their career. So I'll probably just merge them all together and just ask Colin, what would be your top tips for people starting out in the career?
I think to get yourself known. I think to take absolutely every opportunity there is around learning. I know conferencing is a bit difficult at the moment because of everything that's going on, but I think to get people at good clubs, at good federations in all sports, to in many ways be sick of the sight of you. They should be seeing you everywhere, hearing from you everywhere. I think, yeah, being seen and being noticed, I think is important. I think there's so many free learning opportunities out there now, which weren't particularly around when I was at that age, which I think need to be taken advantage of. Yeah, look for the other learning opportunities as well. I mentioned the UKSCA. I think physios picking up that qualification is only going to be making their CV better than the others. That's going to be noticed on CVs, I think, especially in the sports clubs, obviously. I think that's an interesting one. Yeah, be seen. And if you have to go and volunteer or work at a club on a Sunday to work Sunday mornings and internships and stuff like that, perhaps not physios. I think it's hard for physios in that world, but take every opportunity there is to get your face there. We all know stories of people that have been to clubs, done internships, and before you know it, they're in a full-time role. I mean, that happens an awful lot. So, yeah, take every opportunity is the obvious answer, really.
Yeah, definitely some good things. So be seen, I think the big one, but don't bring an ego.
Well, yeah, obvious. Have I made that point clear?
Yeah. Yeah. Ben, we conscious of time, probably got time for one, maybe quick fire, 1 or 2 more.
I was trying to find a quick one, Colin, but I don't know whether this is going to be quick or not, so we'll try and fit it in. But Anonymous has said, really interesting ideas have been presented. What are the thoughts about what in the physiotherapy degree makes a physiotherapist a better practitioner to work in sport and performance contexts than professions such as sports rehab or sports therapy, who spend the full 3 years, including MSK, to the same standard as physiotherapy student? Or is it purely down to the desire to protect the future of the physiotherapy profession in sporting contexts?
Yes.
That's a good one.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. No, I think it's a very, very valid point that sports therapists and the rehab specialists spend the whole of their time there learning sports specific stuff, and the physios are off doing neuro, respiratory, pediatrics, everything else. But having said that, I do think it makes us a more rounded practitioner. I think you learn an awful lot of skills on hospital wards. I think you learn an awful lot of skills from working in 8 different hospitals for 4 weeks. I think the placements are substandard in those degrees, and everyone's going to shout me down probably, but I think I'm generalising. A lot of the ones I know about, the placements are substandard compared to the physios going into work in big teaching hospitals. And that may change. It probably needs to change, but it's not easy. So no, it's a very, very good point. I can't disagree with a lot of what he said, but I think the physiotherapists probably come out a better rounded clinician. And if you get everyone at day 0 as they've just qualified, then I accept it that some of the sports therapists and rehab specialists will have a better knowledge on certain things. Maybe. It's individual, isn't it? I've seen bad physios, I've seen good physios, I've seen bad sports therapists, I've seen really good sports therapists.
Perfect. Yeah, so I'm conscious of time. I think obviously there's a lot of other questions coming through, which Colin, if anybody has any other questions or wants to get in touch with you, or whereabouts can they do that?
Yeah, I don't mind giving out email address.
Yeah.
It's colin@lewinclinic.co.uk. Twitter and Instagram is @the Lewin Clinic. My personal Twitter is @LewinPhysio. So yeah.
Perfect. We'll put them up, and if people have got other questions, and we'll send you through the questions as well, Colin. So if you do have time over the next week or so, great. Just you can have a look.
Views from the sports therapist, please, and the rehab specialist.
Yeah.
Recognise your role.
No, I think a lot of people learn a lot from that. And yeah, sorry we can get through more questions, guys. We've got loads on there, which is brilliant. Yeah, but was there any other sort of final thoughts or closing things you guys wanted to go over?
Not from me, no. I don't know if Colin's got anything, but
not particularly. I thought what was going to come up tonight was this whole idea that medical teams in sport were conservative and coaches and sports scientists and S&C coaches were aggressive, and there was this constant fight between you're holding him back too much, you're pushing him too much, and so on. But I just wanted to say that so many physios out there, and I'm generalising again, but so many physios out there recognise that training, hard training, is a necessary part of injury prevention. And I think this whole myth that physiotherapists want to keep them in, S&C coaches want to do more, hopefully is dying as we progress. But I thought that would come up. I was ready for that point, and it didn't.
Oh.
I thought
we should have planted that one.
Yeah, I know I should have done it. But I think it's really changing. I think it's moving in the right direction as an industry.
Yeah, definitely.
Brilliant.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks again, Colin. Thanks, Ben. All the effort putting into tonight and giving up your time as well. It's much appreciated. And like I said, I think there's a lot of people on this webinar that's learned a lot and had some insights that they wouldn't have had before, and some key takeaways as well. So it's just a reminder to people out there as well. Any key takeaways you've done, just either screenshot this. Unfortunately, it's just our 3 faces on here, but screenshot this and just put on social any of the takeaways that you've had tonight, and we'll pick a question tomorrow probably, and then announce the winner on that. So get you guys some prizes as well from that. So it's all good. But yeah, if there's nothing else from you guys, then I think we'll close it there. Obviously, everybody get a recording of this as well. But yeah, thanks again, guys, and really good hour.
Cheers. Thanks for having me.
Brilliant.
Cheers.
Thanks, Charlie. Thanks, Colin.
Cheers.
Cheers,
Thanks, guys.
See ya.